I'm very pleased to welcome back, actually, Tim Spangler. Tim is a PhD student here, he's a PhD student of mine, but he's also works in practice advising hedge funds, advising alternative investment funds on how to structure themselves, how to set themselves up in different jurisdictions. And he's now teaching UCLA, and he's written, this is your third book, and one of those is in his second edition, so well-established, well-published writer, but whereas two of them are quite technical, academic, practitioner books, the book that he's talking about this evening is much more accessible account of hedge funds, etc. So I'm going to leave Tim to do his stuff. Obviously very eager and keen to take questions. So I'm going to speak first, and then we'll take questions at the end, and allow a good length of time for that.
I don't mind questions during the middle, or beginning, or middle, or end.
All right. But best to get him started.
Yeah. Okay. Let me get a little bit of traction under me, and then you can ask questions. I find being iterative is always the best way of making this interesting and enjoyable for everyone here. Two important things about my book that I think I have to convey right away. The first is that the name is the same name as this presentation, One Step Ahead. So I've got a cold. The second most important thing I can say is it's available at Waterstones, right around the corner, modestly priced. When you look at the price of what my OUP books sell for, you'll see 20 pounds as a steal. I'm really just giving it away. So I want to encourage you. I have to report back to my publisher tomorrow, so that's my sales pitch. I've now checked that box and I can move on. I thought about writing this book in 2008, and I did not. 2008, obviously, August, September, the financial crisis, the collapse of Lehman, really a moment in time where I thought we should start asking better questions about what our financial system is like today. Specifically, ask better questions about hedge funds and private equity. Now, I've been working with hedge funds and private equity funds for 20 years. It's been it was literally the first assignment I got involved in as a newly qualified lawyer 2 decades ago, and it's been the majority of my practice and the entirety of my academic interest ever since then. But the world has changed. The world has changed very, very much. Not only about hedge funds and private equity funds and what they're doing, but public perceptions of hedge funds and private equity funds. When I started practicing 2 decades ago, I remember very clearly I would go to dinner parties, I'd be handed a glass of Sauvignon Blanc, and I'd be standing there making chit-chat with people, and then eventually I was working in America at the time. As anyone here who knows, who's ever actually met an American, the second question they always ask you is, so what do you do? So they can determine what level of importance to ascribe to you. So I'm standing there at these dinner parties with my glass of wine. I say, I'm a lawyer. Okay, it moves the needle a little bit. Okay, I could potentially be interesting to the people asking me the question. And they say, well, what sort of law do you practice? Say, I would respond, I represent hedge funds and private equity funds. And they would look at me blankly in the early 90s. They'd look at me blankly. And they would nod their heads slowly, and they would say, oh, they're like banks. And I would finish my Sauvignon Blanc in one, and I'd say, okay, sure, yeah. I don't have to do that anymore. Most people know the phrase hedge funds. Most people know the phrase private equity funds. It's something that gets talked about a lot. You know you've broken through the mass consciousness when you're name-checked on Sex and the City. We now know that if we're casting a villain, someone who's going to be, a potential but wrong love interest for one of the characters, we make them a hedge fund manager. It's just easier that way. If we were ever to remake Pretty Woman, which is a pet project of mine, if any of you want to come on board and help me finance it, we would not have Richard Gere being an investment banker. How 80s? Thin ties, turned up trousers, it wouldn't work anymore. We would have to make the Richard Gere character a hedge fund manager or a private equity fund manager, because people have heard enough about them to kind of have a place in their mind for hedge funds and private equity funds, and a generally negative view. kind of a hazy negative view about what they are. But they've broken through the public consciousness. You can now read about hedge funds in Rolling Stone magazine. You can now read about private equity funds in Vanity Fair. They've broken through the public consciousness. And I'll talk about in a few minutes, I'll talk about the reasons that is. The reason that they've broken through is because they're so much bigger now. They're bigger now than we ever envisioned them 20 years ago when I started working on them, that they would ever reach the size that they've reached now. And when we talk about that later on, I'll also talk about the types of investors who've gone into these funds and who've really driven that growth. And I think it will surprise you. It always surprises everyone when I walk through where this money is coming from that's been going into private equity and hedge funds. But in 2008, I thought about writing the book and I didn't. I assumed someone else would. This was what started off as the credit crunch. Remember the days when it was just the credit crunch? And then it escalated. It grew from a credit crunch to a Great Recession to a global financial crisis to the GFC. As soon as it became an acronym, we knew it was going to be horrible. I had assumed someone would write about it, and there were a lot of good books. There were a lot of good books that came out about the financial crisis and about the various causes of the financial crisis, and also some ideas about how we could prevent the financial crisis that was occurring then from happening again. But what didn't get written, and what only got touched on very much in passing, were hedge funds and private equity funds. There was some belief when we were laying out the causality chain for the global financial crisis that hedge funds were involved, that somehow hedge funds caused it, were either a proximate cause or somehow indirectly related to what happened. But actually stepping back and asking better questions about what these funds do, why are they here, what purpose do they serve, what promises are they making their investors, are they fulfilling those promises to investors, how do they impact the rest of the financial markets by doing what they do, those questions weren't asked. To the extent that people talked about hedge funds, that was really hedge funds' time to shine, more so than private equity, because I think those who wanted to make a case against private equity found the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 didn't give them that much ammunition. But it did give some ammunition for a group of people, I'll just call them the haters. They're the haters. There are people out there who just like to hate on hedge funds. And many of them thought, okay, now we've got a case to make about hedge funds, because you look at the things that were happening in the weeks and months preceding the financial crisis, which we'll call it the global financial crisis, we'll date it to September 2008. That was just really the most visible flare-up of changes that went on before, things that were happening before, and things, the consequences of which we only saw a little bit later. But when you look at the things leading up to and around 2008, you saw that a lot of these securities, a lot of these transactions had the fingerprints of hedge funds on them. There were hedge funds involved. And so, people, financial journalists, I know some very, very good financial journalists, and I know many, many more of the other type, but I know some very, very good financial journalists. Some of the financial journalists out there who took all their experience as a child playing Pluto and applied it to the financial crisis assumed that if there were fingerprints of hedge funds, if hedge funds were trading these instruments, and hedge funds were making a market in these instruments, therefore hedge funds somehow were involved in the causality of the financial crisis. And you got some chapters of books and some articles that were written that focused on that. Well, there must be something wrong with hedge funds because hedge funds were involved in the trading of these asset-backed securities, in the trading of these CLOs, in the trading of these instruments that ultimately caused the problem. Therefore, if you're involved in the trading of these instruments, you're involved in their generation and the problems that they caused. There's only one small problem with this that wasn't really given a lot of time and attention in 2008 and 2009 when the first history, the first history of the financial crisis was written. And that's, hedge funds have their fingerprints on everything. If it moves, hedge funds have bought and sold it, and are part of the market of buying and selling. Even if it doesn't move, if it's real estate, no matter what it is, if there's financial value in it, you will find the fingerprints of hedge funds all around them. That's what hedge funds do. At their very, very fundamental core, they trade. By some estimates, 50% of all of the trades on the London Stock Exchange, 50% of the trades on the New York Stock Exchange involve hedge funds. A lot of people buy and hold securities. A lot of people buy and hold stocks and bonds. My Aunt Edna buys and holds stocks and bonds. She does. She's the perfect image to bear in mind of someone who buys and holds investments. What she doesn't do is trade. And that's what hedge funds do. Hedge funds trade. Hedge funds make markets. Hedge funds are out there buying and selling and buying and selling and buying and selling. By doing that, they provide liquidity. If someone's buying and selling an instrument, and there's enough buying and selling, the hedge funds will find that opportunity naturally. That's their function. They'll find that opportunity. They'll start developing ideas about pricing. Oh, these people are underpricing the security. These people are overpricing the security. And by adding more trading volume, be able to exact profits. Some will win and some will lose. We look at the global financial crisis. Some people were saying hedge fund caused this financial crisis. That was one story. That was one narrative we read about. The other narrative we read about is, oh, hedge funds are profiting off our misery. There's this horrible thing happening in the financial markets, and the hedge funds have just circled around it and are profiting from it. Spivs and speculators. That's what someone on Mr. Preston called them once on the BBC. He called them spivs and speculators. But what we have to understand is part of the creation of liquidity comes from being able to trade back and forth in these instruments. And you look at the aftermath of the financial crisis. Anyone who's read books like The Big Short by Michael Lewis knows that there were a handful of hedge funds that made a lot of money, made stonkingly large amounts of money. By far, more hedge funds lost money and had to shut their doors than made money off those months of the global financial crisis. And as many of you know who follow this space or read the Financial Times with any regularity, some of the people who made a lot of money in 2009 lost a lot of money in 2011. One of the things I want to suggest to you is there's a narrative about hedge funds always win. Private equity funds always win. They win because somehow, as soon as you think, okay, they always win, there must be something about the playing field that's tilted in their favor. The reality is there were at almost 9,000, I've heard different numbers, but almost 9,000 hedge funds in existence January 1, 2008. By December 31st, 2009, so we had to go through the financial crisis, that number went from the high 8,000s, just under 9,000, to just over 6,000. So you basically had about 25% of the universe of hedge funds close their doors. We're done. We're out of here. Either because they lost the confidence of the investors, because they lost the money, or they just decided this wasn't a game that they understood anymore. What was happening in the financial markets wasn't something that they understood anymore. So you had this huge decrease in the number of hedge funds out there. Some of them did well, some of them continued to do well, but there was a huge shakeup in the industry. And that leads to a lot of questions about the barriers to entry, about the decision-making process of which fund managers to back. If 2 years was enough to get rid of 25% of the hedge funds, globally, that's a global number, then how many of them should have been formed in the beginning? How many had legitimate claims on their track record? How many were able to prove them, had sufficiently proved themselves in other careers or other endeavors to justify having a hedge fund? So lots of important questions that can be asked. And as 2008 led into 2009, led into 2010, no one sat down and wrote that book. So in 2011, I thought about, again, I sat down, I thought about writing this book. But come September 2011, we had the Occupy movement. So I thought, I'm not going to have to write the book now, because this is the most meaningful political protest movement in a generation, maybe two. Occupy Wall Street was going to be the forum, was going to be the platform that we started asking questions about Wall Street. Remember, it was Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street, Zuccotti Park. Walked by it hundreds of times when I worked in New York. It is in the heart of Wall Street. I was very encouraged. I thought, now we're going to start asking better questions about the financial markets, better questions about the way we regulate them, and hopefully start a better discussion about hedge funds and private equity funds. So I sat down very, very comfortably on my sofa and thought, okay, someone else will now come on the scene and write this book asking better questions about hedge funds and private equity funds. But there was a problem with Occupy Wall Street. There's a problem with Occupy Wall Street, especially as it began to grow and it began to spread. It lost its focus on Wall Street. It started talking about student debt. It started talking about GM food. It started talking about investment banker salaries, which is a good thing. But it also started talking about the forgiveness of all debts. That's not really a conversation starter if you're sitting down with a room of financial professionals and advisors about what to do about the future structure of the financial markets. Item 1, forgive all debt. Kind of goes downhill from there. You don't really get to the second PowerPoint slide if that's on your first PowerPoint slide. So this conversation I thought we would have, and I was not concerned, unlike some of my colleagues, I was not concerned that there were outsiders who were involved in the Occupy movement and were driving the Occupy discussion, if we want to call it that. Because Wall Street and the city matter to all of us. If it matters to Aunt Edna, my Aunt Edna, who's sitting there with her portfolio of stocks and bonds, braying, looking at the twilight of her life rapidly approaching her, then anyone else can have a view on the financial markets. It's amazing when you think about the scope of things we have views on. We have views on so many things. Just walk down wherever people line up with tables to ask for petitions and hand out flyers. We have opinions on such a great range of social and political and many economic topics. We walk around with these opinions and we feel fully capable of holding these opinions, even though we've never been to the country involved, we've never engaged in the transaction involved. We have no personal experience in this aspect of life at all, but we have opinions on them. But when we come to Wall Street in the city, and it comes to the financial markets, all of a sudden people, oh no, it's too complicated. I don't understand, it's too complicated. And we have this reluctance to really engage in a broad-based discussion or debate about what's going on. So Occupy could have been a very, very good starter to that. Because regardless of what your job is, you might say, well, I don't need to have an opinion on financial regulation because I'm never going to work in the city. I'm never going to work in the city. I'm never going to marry or get into a long-term relationship with someone who works in the city, which is probably better than working in the city yourself. So I have nothing at stake. I have nothing at stake. You do. You have a pension, you have a mortgage, you have a credit card. If you're like me at your age, you have several credit cards, only a handful of which you tell your parents or your other people in your family about. You're very closely engaged in the financial markets, and it has a lot of direct impact on you. And if the financial markets impact you, then entities and institutions that drive the financial markets, like private equity and hedge funds, are important to you as well. But yet again, I was disappointed because September went into October, November, December, it started to get cold. It gets cold in Manhattan in the late weeks of December. And what started off, I think, very optimistically on my part, as potentially a forum to ask really new and different questions about Wall Street, degenerated into kind of it's like Glastonbury without a band, and it kind of fizzled out in the weeks that followed. So I was very disappointed. I was very, very disappointed at the start of 2012. I thought, I'm going to have to write this book. I'm going to have to write this book. The only way I can avoid writing this book is, I don't know, let's think crazy. We've got an election coming up. Maybe if someone who was just born and bred in private equity or hedge funds, maybe if we could convince someone like that to run for the highest office in America, then all of those journalists who just sit there copying and pasting press releases or just following their own personal political narrative and the stories that they cover, maybe we would get the entire global media establishment on the job asking better questions about Wall Street and the city, and therefore asking better questions about hedge funds and private equity funds. Lo and behold, my prayers were answered. In walked Mitt Romney. I was so happy. What we're going to have now is basically a full year, because you're very lucky in Britain. Political campaigns here last 3 weeks. And they get one-party political broadcast. So it's a very, very condensed experience. With presidential elections in America run for years, primaries run for a year before that. And so I thought, Mitt Romney, he'll get the nomination. You know, it would be great if we could get someone from Central Casting who just looks so much like the kind of person people imagine is involved in private equity funds and hedge funds. And I just thought, I'll just be crazy. I mean, let's just be fantastical now. You know, let's have someone, maybe even we can get him to have like a picture of himself in a jacket stuffed with $100 bills coming out of the pocket. That's crazy. Until a photo exactly of that came up as part of the political campaign. A photo that he took when he and his comrades in arms launched his firm, Bain Capital, a decade or so before, longer than that, probably 15 or more years before the campaign. On the day they launched, he actually had a photo taken with $100 bills all stuck in all of his pockets. Great photo. Great photo. But this was it. Finally, running for president, someone who had made a fortune. He would have been the wealthiest president we ever had by a long shot. We're not talking Bush money. We're not talking Kennedy money. That's pennies, nickels and dimes. We're talking $250 million was what he was worth. So finally, we were going to have a focus on private equity, at least. If 2008 was a great time for hedge funds because it fit the narrative of the collapse of the financial markets and asset-backed securities and mortgage lending and ninja loans and all of that, private equity, maybe that would do it. We've got a private equity professional running for the highest office of the land. And it started to get political, a lot of vitriol, a lot of campaign rhetoric. It became, at least in the early months, Republicans tried half-heartedly to defend private equity, although most of the original body blows that were landed on Mitt Romney as a private equity professional were landed by other Republican candidates. Like Newt Gingrich, who was able to indulge in his cinematic fantasies. He helped produce and put onto YouTube a little video called "When Mitt Romney Came to Town," and created this narrative of vultures and vampires. Basically, any word that started with a V was great to hang as an epithet in front of private equity. Here's a picture of private equity as an industry, as a group of individuals who come in and destroy companies and destroy jobs. And interesting, those first attacks came from the right, came from Republicans who were trying to slow the Romney momentum down. But once he got the nomination, basically everyone came on side, and it started to become the Democrats, the Democratic Party, who started attacking private equity as vultures and as vampires. In some way trying to picture, which is anyone who's a student of American politics knows, trying to paint the Republicans as the party of capital and paint the Democrats as the party of the workers. But that doesn't fit their own histories at all. They're much more regional parties that have sometimes literally flip-flopping views as decades pass on the key issues of the day. But trying to maintain this. There are problems with that view. One of the places where you can see the problem of that view is, the Democratic Party as being the anti-private equity, anti-hedge fund, anti-Wall Street party, is the fact that, for example, in 2008, Obama, when he first ran for the White House, significantly outraised on Wall Street. You can go to the FEC, the Federal Election Commission website, and just spend a whole weekend going through the various filings. Massively outraised over McCain. So you're talking about a party and a president who initially had enormous support from Wall Street, enormous support from many hedge funds and private equity funds. Even as that has shifted, because the candidates tend to be able to make more promises of any party than actually incumbent politicians are able to fill. You saw then in the 2012 election that swayed a little bit more to Romney. You had more people on Wall Street, more hedge funds and private equity funds supporting Romney. But you still had massive support for the Democratic ticket. And a lot of people with private equity and hedge fund backgrounds in the cabinet, in the administration, performing very, very important roles. But one of the things that started to bleed through this debate, we had this polarization, hedge fund, private equity funds good, hedge funds, private equity fund bad. Some people got off script. And it got to be a little bit awkward, only for moments, but I think it was interesting when and how it occurred. The new senator for the great state of New Jersey was last summer, a gentleman by the name of Cory Booker, last summer was the mayor of Newark. And he went on, I forget which channel it was, but it was one of the 24-hour rolling news channels. And they were asking, he was a Democrat, and he was supporting President Obama. And he was on as a surrogate or proxy. And one of the topics that was being asked on that news show was private equity and how bad private equity was. And would the mayor of Newark like to comment on how incredibly deviously evil private equity funds are? And surprisingly, the mayor of the city of Newark did not accept that invitation. And he said, actually, private equity is a term that covers a lot of different firms that do a lot of different things. But I have to say, as the mayor of Newark, I've got a lot of city retirement plans. I've got a lot of city institutions that have money. And that money needs to be invested. And that money is invested, among other things, in private equity funds. And those private equity funds we invest in come back and do a lot of good things for our citizens and our employees. So in the debate of 2012 over private equity and hedge funds, this was a resounding vote of support from someone on the Democratic side, someone on the wrong side of the aisle. And the questions were, would this change the nature of the debate? People were asking, Booker's come on record and he said these things. How will this impact? Well, the impact was muted 24 hours later. And it's a horrible experience anytime you have to do this. You have to go into your office, you've got to look in the camera and record your walking your statements back for YouTube. And that's exactly what he did. He sat in front of a camera in his office and he said, I don't want people to misunderstand what I said yesterday on television. Some people think that what I said on television was that private equity funds are good. I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. Private equity funds are bad. Really? I mean, you look at the video footage of what he said, you look at his retraction, he was asked, and he did, walk that statement back. Private equity funds were bad. That was the narrative of the election. And we weren't going to get any deeper than that. We weren't going to get any more meaningful analysis. Even when you had the former president of the United States of America, and somewhat reluctant, but highly effective, surrogate for President Obama, William Jefferson Clinton. Clinton actually went on Piers Morgan, which is a horrific experience, I know, for anyone to have to do, but he went on there. And he was asked by Piers Morgan about what his view was on the private equity debate. And he said, quote, "Private equity does good work," quote, end quote. He didn't record a YouTube video the next day walking that statement back. He didn't. And we'll talk about why someone who, remember the penultimate night of the Democratic National Convention when Bill Clinton stood up there and gave his speech. And in Charlotte, North Carolina, thousands of people in the basketball stadium, everyone's going bananas. He gave classic Bill Clinton Democratic Party policies, and he said them, and he invigorated the people in the crowd. He made someone very excited, everyone there very excited. A dyed-in-the-wool Democrat, I don't think anyone would say, well, a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat was able to come on television to Piers Morgan and say, private equity does good work. Other than that, the debate, the discussion, kind of fizzled out. In the last few months of the campaign, it was vaguely, well, people aren't going to relate to Mitt Romney because he's wealthy, because he's just so wealthy and he's got an experience very disconnected from the American voter. But it ceased to be any sort of meaningful attempt to talk about private equity and hedge funds and talk about them in a new and different way. And we all know the results on Election Day, and it made me very, very depressed, not because that wasn't the result that I wanted in the election, but because I now realize it's back to me again to have to write this book. I'm 0 for 3. I'm 0 for 3. But I was very confident in my ability to procrastinate. Even though no one else had written this book, I knew I would have to do it, but hey, I've been procrastinating for 5 years. I could easily procrastinate another 5 years. And then something highly unfortunate happened. I was skiing in Northern California on New Year's Eve, and I had a catastrophic skiing accident and broke my leg in 7 different places. I'm now walking around with 16 screws and 3 metal plates. After surgery, 2 things happened. I was given a prescription for OxyContin. Highly recommended. Highly recommend it. I made a big mistake, and I only realized this in hindsight. I actually had a prescription for, I think, 30 or 50 tablets of OxyContin. I took it for 7 days. I'm like, this is the most amazing thing ever, and I can't do this. So I ended up not moving from OxyContin to Percocet. I know this is very interesting for you. And then after 2 weeks, I went under Tylenol. I'm actually quite fine. I don't know if you noticed the limp. It's not so bad. I'll be running marathons in a few years, even though I've never run a marathon in my life. But what this? Oh, let me finish the story. I actually threw away the second script. I got a 7-day script and I got a 30-day script for the OxyContin. Not needing the 30-day, I threw it away. And someone told me how much I could have gotten if I walked to the high school and just tapped someone on the shoulder. Hey, you with the headphones, come over here. How much will you give me for a script of 30 OxyContin? You could have made a fortune. Any kid, they told me, just pick any kid at the high school. They'll be able to take it off your hands. But what that meant is I was 7 weeks on medical leave. You write 2,000 words a day for 49, 50 days, you get a book. So in January and February of this year, I actually sat down and wrote this book, which is in some ways an assimilation of a lot of the points that I've talked about. It's as much a book about politics as it is about economics. I think if you go to Waterston's, which I think they're open late, I think it's very easy to go after this to any one of the Waterston's here, and you look on the shelf of books on hedge funds or books on the city or books on private equity, they tend to either they tend to focus on highly technical aspects that assume a very, very high level of prior knowledge. They're like manuals for computers or software programs, and like everything you need to know about the software program. But it assumes a high level of knowledge and a high level of commitment to get even more knowledge. Or they tend to be recutting, copying and pasting what financial journalists have written. And you've already gotten for free on the internet, or you've paid $1 a day to subscribe to their newspaper, and they're selling it to you again, but not really raising the bar much in how they're analyzing it. What I hope in my book to do is that by stressing both the political and social elements and the economic and financial elements make both a book that more people could read and also a book that would push people to achieve what I want the goal of the book to be, which is really to ask better questions. I think if we understand hedge funds and private equity funds better, we'll be able to ask better questions about what they are and what they do, and then be able to come back and say, well, these are more effective regulations, more effective rules that we can have, and have a better conversation, rather than having a polarized conversation. Because now that the election is behind us, we realize it's not black and white. It's not black and white. To use the colors that are now ascribed to American politics, hedge funds and private equity funds, and Wall Street in general, is not a red state or blue state issue. These are topics that cut across the political divide. I'll give you an example of this. I'll give you, I think, a very good example. Let's go back to March and April of 2012. Romney is now the presumptive nominee. Everyone has very much drawn the chalk lines on the pitch, so we knew what the two different opposing camps would be debating about and arguing and advertising in the months to come. In the middle of this, when you had President Obama himself using words like vampire, when you had his proxies and surrogates out there on the campaign trail and doing the 24-hour media cycle, going out and saying very, very negative things about private equity and Wall Street and the like, what important piece of legislation did President Obama sign? He signed the Jobs Act. How many people here have heard of the Jobs Act? It's a very important piece of financial regulation in the U.S., which, I'll forgive you if you were as surprised as I was, has nothing to do with jobs. Nothing to do with jobs. We thought, oh, if someone passes a Jobs Act, it's going to be about jobs. It's not about jobs. The Jobs Act was about two different things. One was to make it much, much, much easier to buy private securities, like hedge funds and private equity funds. The feeling was, apparently, despite the political rhetoric that was being used on the campaign trail, we need to put more money in private securities. We need to put more money in hedge funds. We need to put more money in private equity funds. The other thing that the Jobs Act did is something called crowdfunding. It's like crowdsourcing, but for money. Neither of them directly or indirectly involve jobs. What became apparent as the Jobs Act was being marched at quite a pace through the legislative process and ultimately to President Obama's desk for signature, was that the chief beneficiaries of the Jobs Act were going to be hedge funds and private equity funds. Those were the constituencies that if you worked everything out and put a cold towel on your head and really thought through who's actually going to use these new marketing tools that are being provided by the Jobs Act, the hedge funds and private equity funds. So in the middle of a campaign where you were very much trying to create a pro-private equity argument and an anti-hedge fund argument, the president, who was at least notionally leading the anti-private equity camp, signed this piece of legislation that significantly opened the barn door for hedge funds and private equity funds and other private securities to really go out into America and find more and more investors. That's why breaking it down into a red state and blue state issue doesn't really help. It's much more complicated than that. And the reason it's much more complicated is this. Why have private equity and hedge funds gotten so much bigger? So much bigger now than they were 20 years ago? And the answer, I think, will surprise you. Most people, when they think about the types of people who would put money into private equity funds and who would put money into hedge funds, have an image. And that image is either someone who looks surprisingly like Mitt Romney with $100 bills stuck in their pocket, or looks like the guy on Monopoly. You know the guy on the Monopoly board with the top hat and the tails, and he's got coins and cash going up. These are the sorts of people that we oftentimes think are the ones putting their money into hedge funds and private equity funds. And then we can justify our ambivalence. We can justify our ambivalence. We can say, well, it's just rich people managing other rich people's money, so we don't have a dog in this fight. It's not important for us to go and break this down and understand it. It's just rich people managing other rich people's money. That's not true. That's not true. The majority of money in private equity funds and the majority of new money flowing into hedge funds, because hedge funds had a different genealogy growing up. So really you have to look back the last 5 or 10 years. The majority of new money going into hedge funds, the majority of all the money in private equity fund comes from a surprising source. It comes from U.S. public pension plans. If there's someone that you want to blame, when you read a story, it makes you angry every time you read the story, and you read it about once a week or once a month, there's a private equity fund, and they've come into town, and they've bought a company, provides 1,000 jobs to this community. Maybe it makes a product that you love, like in America, Twinkies. I'm sure you're like me, you love Twinkies. And when the company that made Twinkies looked like they were going out of business, you're probably like me, you had a lot of sleepless nights, you thought about stockpiling, you've got that empty bit of space in the attic, how much could you stuff up there if you had to start laying in Twinkie supplies? And you read the story and hear wagon wheels. Wagon wheels, how many people here eat wagon wheels or know what wagon wheels are? They, another company, another confectionery company that has been bought by private equity. When you hear the story about the private equity fund comes in, buys this company, to make our math easy, we'll call it $100 million. Buys this company for $100 million, has 1,000 employees, and then what happens, you know the story, because you read it so often. They start firing people, so instead of 1,000 people, it's 500 people. They start changing suppliers, they start changing their distribution. They form an offshore call center. They're just doing horrible, horrible things with this company, causing misery, objective, measurable misery from their actions. And what happens at the end of 3, 4, 5 years? 3, 4, 5 years, that company, they bought for $100 million. They now sell for $300 million. Ha! Ha! They've now turned $100 million into $300 million. And in addition to firing all these people and moving these jobs overseas and opening that offshore call center, they piled the company with debt. They piled the company with debt. And somehow they've managed to pass the whole monstrosity on to someone else and collect $300 million. $300 million minus $100 million is $200 million of profit. Let's assume that this fund is exactly the same as the statistical average, and slightly over half of the money comes from U.S. public pension plans. Let's keep the math simple. $200 million of profit. How much of that money is going to teachers and policemen and firemen and postal workers and government employees in Florida and Texas and Oregon and California? Half. $100 million of the $200 million goes to public pension plans. And the teachers and the firemen and the policemen and the government workers who get their retirement benefits. The second largest category by type of investors are universities and charitable endowments. Anyone who's gone to an American university or is familiar with American universities, they are massive investors. Massive investors. They have these huge endowments, massive endowments. And there's actually a chief investment officer of Yale University, Swanson, who radically changed the way that public pension plans and university endowments and other institutional investors manage their money. Because for 25 years, he's been saying barbell. Low risk, low return, but low cost. High risk, high return, but higher cost. There's no reason to be in the middle. You go low risk, low return, low cost, high risk, high return, high cost. And so many public pension plans and so many university endowments follow this investment plan that over the last 20 years, the investment balance in private equity and hedge funds has shifted because of this demand. So you get $100 million of the profit going to public pension plans, maybe $10 to $20 million of that $200 million going to university endowments, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, any of those sort of do-gooder associations that are sitting on huge piles of cash. And then for the services rendered, the men and women at the private equity firm who actually delivered this profit, didn't promise the profit, didn't talk about it coming someday in the future, actually delivered the profit, gets 20%. 20%. Half goes to public pension plans, U.S. public pension plans. 20% goes to pay the people who actually found the company, bought the company, engaged in the transactions as agents for the fund, changed the company, and were successful at it. If the $100 million company that was bought went into bankruptcy, private equity fund gets nothing. They get a management fee, but they don't get some huge share. They don't get some huge payday. They only get 20% if they're able to generate actual, verifiable, cash-in-hand profits. So that's the split. That's the split. And the return that some private equity funds and some hedge funds earn is enough to entice year after year after year after year more investors, more institutional investors like U.S. public pension plans to put their money in these funds. Why do investors like CalPERS, CalSTRS, New York Common, Texas Teachers, why do they put money into these funds? Because a number of them, not all of them, a number of them generate spectacularly high returns on a fairly consistent, repeatable basis. Not all of them. Not all of them. But you can say that about people kicking a football on a Saturday. If you look at everyone kicking a football in Britain on a Saturday, there are going to be a large number of them who aren't very good. And there's going to be a handful, we have 98 professional teams in England now, in the 4 divisions. There are going to be some of them that kick the ball very well. Some of them kick it unbelievably well and get massively high salaries. One of the questions that we have to wrestle with when we're looking at this relationship between public pension plans and the flows of money that have gone into hedge funds and private equity funds is a question about talent. I oftentimes get asked when I'm giving presentations like this or I'm talking to the media, do you believe in hedge funds? Are hedge funds for real? Are hedge funds for real? Are they a scam? Just tell me they're a scam. I want to write that story. I want to write a story that says hedge funds are a scam, and then I can go on and do other things with my career. And I'm like, I can't. You're asking me, do I believe in hedge funds? I need to ask you a question. Do you believe in talent? Do you believe that some people just kick a soccer ball better than other people? Do you think that some people play the guitar or sing or write novels or play music better than other people? If you believe that in human endeavor, generally, there is something called talent. There are people who do it better than other people for whatever reason. We don't have to get into causality now. Then you've got to ask that question about investing. Are there people who just invest better than other people? I know there are a lot of people who invest better than me. You should look at my pension account. I've lost tons of money. So I know they're better investors than me. If you believe in talent, then one of the better questions that we can be asking about hedge funds and private equity funds is how do we connect people with money and no talent with people with talent and no money in a way that both serve each other's interests. What we see when we look at hedge funds and private equity funds is a very particular solution to this dilemma. One of the great questions that underlies so many structural changes in the city and on Wall Street, and particularly in hedge funds and private equity funds, is a question about talent. How do we acquire talent? How do we retain talent? How do we compensate talent? And how do we allow that talent to sell itself, to be able to engage in the talented activity that talent he or she wants to engage in. Private equity and hedge funds are a particular solution to that. They're a solution, interestingly enough, driven by the fact that managing money is not a balance sheet business. Managing money is not a balance sheet business. Take the example of a hedge fund. To be a hedge fund manager, you need a Bloomberg screen, you need a phone, and you need a big pile of money. Not your own money. Not your own money. The best kind of money. There are different kinds of money. I'm sure they teach that here. Basically, I divide money into other people's money and my money. That's kind of how I divide the world up. And what you see with a fund is other people's money. You've got to understand that when you think about hedge funds and private equity funds. Hedge fund, the money that's being used by the private equity fund to buy that company in that little seaside town that we're just so in love with, and we wanted it to stay family owned, and we wanted it to continue to produce Twinkies or wagon wheels or whatever great confectionery it produces. That money is other people's money. I actually set up, this is when I should know. This is when I should know that we were approaching a hedge fund bubble. I actually, when I lived in London, I lived and worked in London for 12 years, I actually got a hedge fund manager registered and authorized by what was then the Financial Services Authority. You have to have a site visit. You have to have a physical site if you're authorized by the FSA, and then someone from the FSA comes out and inspects it. The physical site for his money management firm was his living room. His living room. The business model was basically wake up at 8:45 in the morning, put on fuzzy slippers and robe, walk into living room, grab coffee from counter, and start trading. And he got authorized. He got authorized. He got $100 million in a couple of months from investors. That was his model. That's all you need. Fuzzy slippers and robe optional. All you need is a Bloomberg screen, a phone, and other people's money. It's very, very easy to set these firms up. You don't benefit from being at JP Morgan. You don't benefit from being at Morgan Stanley. There's very little at Goldman Sachs that you need. They won't sell you wholesale as an independent firm. So we have these convergence of factors. We have all of this money going into funds. Why the old quote from the gangster in the U.S., John Dillinger, why do you rob banks? Reporters asked him as he was being taken off in cuffs. Because that's where the money is, which I think is a great philosophy in life. Why do institutional investors put money into these funds? Because basically, generally, they produce much higher returns. Not all the time, not all of them, but they tend to produce very, very high returns. So we've got this drive to push more and more money into these vehicles. These vehicles are largely unregulated, either in the UK or in the US or in other onshore jurisdictions, and it's relatively easy to set them up. So that's why we're seeing this growth in this area. So what I attempted with my book over the course of the 7 weeks that I was on medical leave was to go through and really break down where these funds came from. They're not a recent phenomenon. Hedge funds and private equity funds have been around for decades and decades and decades. What led them to grow, the political issues, fundamentally political issues, about how they're regulated and the types of investors that we let into these funds. Under the Jobs Act signed by Obama last year, we now have the barn door open much more widely for individual investors to put their money in these funds. We know that institutional investors investing the money of retired policemen, firemen, teachers, and the like are putting large amounts of money. There are political questions everywhere. What I try to do in the book is lay out these various factors. So hopefully, finally, having now written the book, we can go about asking better questions about who these funds are, what these funds are doing, and what sort of response, what sort of informed, nuanced response we should have to them. Those are my prepared remarks for today, but I'm more than glad to answer any and all questions that you have, whether they're related to hedge funds and private equity funds or not. But thank you very much for your patience. Do you have any questions? Right.
I think I'm Brazilian, so I speak for Brazil. There's this
Fantastic. You speak for Brazil. Awesome.
Sorry.
I want to get you on the record on a few things, but
I'm sorry about that. No, I'm kidding, but there's this discussion about the regulations applying to asset managers
Yes.
in Brazil. They are changing the regulations, they are discussing it with the players in the market. And what do you think that the regulations, of the fiduciary duties of asset managers play in this?
It's a very, very good question. It's a very, very good question. Now, I'll give you a bit of practice-oriented advice. Anyone here who's going to be a practicing lawyer. Anytime you hear that word, the F word, fiduciary, you put the pen down, you lay your tablet down, you take a pause. Because that word is a very, very powerful word, fiduciary. As a practicing lawyer, you will be a fiduciary to your clients. Your doctor is a fiduciary to you. The person selling you, the person on the high street, you're going, it's the Friday before the FA Cup final, you've decided I'm going to get a flat screen TV, a brand new flat screen TV for my flat, because on my team's in the FA Cup final, I want to watch it in glory. I don't have a lot of money to spend, I'm going to buy a 50-inch flat screen TV. It's going to be brilliant. You go into the high street shop. The person who then spends the next 45 minutes convincing you, mate, no. 50-inch? No. You want 107-inch. You need 107-inch with 3D glasses. Imagine all your friends there. The salesman who spends the next 45 minutes getting you not to buy the 50-inch screen TV and getting you to buy the 107-inch screen flat screen TV for like 4 times as much money, he or she does not owe you a fiduciary duty. He doesn't. She doesn't. And you kind of know that. You kind of don't go into the high street shop expecting, Ashley, you've told me about you've said a few things while we've been talking about your financial situation, your credit card debt, your crippling student loans. You really shouldn't even get a 50-inch TV. You should here's a 27-inch, actually just watch it on your phone. Just watch it on your phone and get out of here. That's what someone with a fiduciary duty would do. Asset managers are fiduciaries. Asset managers are fiduciaries. I always get contracts from clients who they've drafted because they want to save money. Wait till I get through with it. We'll run up more fees with my reviewing your contract, and if you let me write the contract, I will teach you. And they'll have phrases in there saying that we're a discretionary manager, we have an ability to pick securities that have that we want, we don't have to go for you for approval, we have a full power of attorney, and we're not a fiduciary. Really? A fiduciary is a relationship of trust. I personally believe it's very fruitless to make too many arguments about an asset manager not being a fiduciary. I think what we can do, one of the constructive things we can do with legal reform and new rules and regulations is make changes that accentuate and bring people's attention to the fiduciary duty. Because it's there. It's a relationship of trust. You're giving money to someone else, they're investing that money on your behalf, and when they lose it all, so you've given your money to my cousin Irv. My cousin Irv is a money manager. You've given my cousin Irv your money, and he's, I'm going to invest it in this, I'm going to invest in that, I'm going to make so much money. 3 months later, you get a call from Irv. I'm really sorry, I lost all of it. Not some of it, not most of it. I actually lost all of it. In 3 months, that's pretty impressive. As a money manager, that's fine. You can be angry, you can throw your phone on the ground, you can kick a pillow. There's nothing you can do about it. It's not illegal for a fund manager to lose all of your money. It's not illegal. It's not illegal. That's not the contract you enter into. What you enter into is a fiduciary contract, a contract for services, where the investment manager says, I will do the best I can managing the money, but I'm not guaranteeing any results. And the check on that, the counterweight, if you want to think about that, is the fiduciary duty. My cousin Irv may be an idiot. He is an idiot, actually. But there's nothing illegal for now about being stupid. As long as you're not negligent, as long as you're not so criminally negligent in what you're doing, if you're just unlucky, if you're the kind of person that if you invested in films, you would only invest in films starring Madonna. If that's the kind of film investor you'd be, that's the kind of investments you're making, you can lose all of the client's money. And there's nothing they can do unless you've breached a fiduciary duty, unless you've lied to them, unless you've misrepresented your educational experience. My cousin Herb is an idiot, but he said he graduated from Harvard. He said he had a Harvard MBA. Now you can go after him, not for losing all your money, but for lying. So if we focus on fiduciary duty and we make sure everyone in the organization understands the importance of the fiduciary duty as it cuts across the entire relationship, I think that's a very constructive way of making regulatory reform. Any other questions? We've got heaps of time. Questions?
Two questions. Could you possibly, first of all, thank you very much for the speech. Could you possibly comment on the hedge funds in Canada? Because I recently read in The Economist that apparently they don't do the 220 structure. They simply charge 1% of a management fee, and they have a very different attitude to the Americans in how they do these.
Well, you can say that generally.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's America with social insurance. No, but and the second thing is the Dodd-Frank Act and the shadow banking system in general, because the recent fears have come up that the industry has been gaining so much money. As you said, there's so much money piling in there. How are you going to regulate that? Because we're having this huge banking regulation. What are you going to do if there's a default on that side?
Very, very, very good questions. I'll start off by talking about Canada. I love Canada. I love Canadians. When I was your age or a little younger, I spent months traveling around the world. And I was so proud of Canada. I was so proud of Canada that I made sure everywhere I went, I had a Canadian flag on my backpack. I don't know why people assumed that meant I was Canadian, but it worked for me. I didn't get in any trouble traveling around the Middle East in the early 90s. So it was a good thing. So I love Canada. I love Canada. The Canadians are different. And then we get into a definitional problem. We get into a definitional problem about what is a hedge fund. Is a hedge fund, we can talk about hedge funds being vehicles, and we can talk about hedge funds being a particular type of legal vehicle with a particular type of structure, including compensation, but also the vehicles used. Or we can talk about hedge funds being an investment strategy. If you short sell securities, you're a hedge fund. If you engage in a lot of leverage, you're a hedge fund. And I think a lot of the reporting that goes on confuses the two. So an article or a report or a law review piece will start talking about vehicles, hedge funds as vehicles. It's a particular type of entity or regulatory categorization, but will then drift over into talking about hedge funds more as just investment strategies. On the question of compensation, there's a trend now of a lot of different managers to say they offer hedge funds. We have an investment strategy that is 130/30 or alt mutual fund or whatever, and talk about, well, we're basically delivering a hedge fund type structure, a hedge fund type investment strategy. But what it turns out to be, it's really just another type of retail product or another type of regulated or some variety of long-only product that they're sexing up a bit. 2 and 20, the 20% performance fee, I don't know where in Leviticus it says, thou shalt earn 20% on managed money in an alternative asset class, but it must say it somewhere. Because the 20% carried interest for private equity funds and the 20% performance fee for hedge funds is just across the board. And you see very, very little downward negotiation. You see very few, because you'd think, if you thought about this rationally, if you thought about this abstractly, you thought, well, it would be a free market. Eventually there will be new entrants which, to gain market share, would lower their prices. But you see no price competition, and no price competition. Sometimes you see it on the higher end. You've got people like SAC Capital, Steve Cohen's old firm, as was. And he was known to charge 20% as a minimum, but then 30 and 50%. So if the returns were high enough, he would take 50% of your profits, but you don't see competition on the lower end. Why is that? Why is that? And that's why I think an example of better questions we can ask about the structure and operation of hedge funds and private equity funds, and particularly the relationship between managers and investors. How many of you here are familiar with behavioral finance? The concept of behavioral finance. That's basically looking, I love it. I've read very little of it, but every time I hear someone talk about it, I think it's brilliant. So I have very broad, positive views of it, basically based on the fact that I've actually read little of it. But what it basically draws our attention to are the subjective factors. The subjective factors, the irrational factors that play in investment decisions and economic decisions that we make. Because we want to think that everyone's always rational. Everyone's always rational, especially when they're making economic decisions. But what behavioral finance teaches us is that's not always the case. Now, when you decide tomorrow to go out and buy that Maserati, you've been saving up for it for years. You go to the Maserati dealer is very glad to see you. He's not giving you water in a plastic bottle. He's breaking out the Pellegrino. He's treating you very, very well. And you've been thinking about the Maserati, and you're so excited to buy it, and he tells you about the engine, and he tells you about the thermodynamic design, and he talks to you about the little toaster oven that's tucked in underneath the glove box. He's telling you all the great things about the Maserati, and you think it's a great car. You believe it's a great car. You think it might be the best car that you will ever buy. But there's one thing he says at the very end of that conversation that convinces you, without a doubt, that it is the best possible car ever. What is the last thing he tells you? The price. You know it's good. It costs £185,000. It has to be good. It has to be good. It makes you feel reassured to know that you're spending that much money. When you're going to see a play tonight, or we probably miss it tonight, tomorrow night, and you're going around Covent Garden, and you see a fine entrepreneur standing there in front of a blanket, and on that blanket are nice rows of handbags. And you say, actually, I saw that handbag on the internet. I want to buy that handbag. How much is that handbag? 20 quid. 20 quid. Do you have a lot of faith in the quality of that handbag? No. The same basic argument applies to hedge fund managers. So a hedge fund manager comes up to you and says, I'm brilliant. I'm a genius. I can manage money better than anyone you'll get a meeting with this year. I'm it. I'm the best, smartest person. And on top of that, I could charge you 20%, but I'm not. I'm going to charge you 5%, or I'm going to charge you nothing. I'm just going to take a straight management fee. What are people going to think? If you're so good, why are you meeting with me? But why are you just magnanimously giving up? You can't find people who would hire you at a traditional fee rate. Why are you discounting? Why are you discounting? There is something very subjective, but comforting about the fee structure and the consistency of the fee structures across the line. Because at the time an investor writes the check for a hedge fund or private equity fund, that investor, that human being, that man or woman is convinced that he or she is giving a check to the Lionel Messi of investing. The Tendulkar of investing. That's what they believe at that time. They have to believe that. They're not thinking, I'm giving this check to this idiot, my cousin Irv. And I know he's an idiot, and I know he's probably going to lose my money, but as he's losing my money, I'm only being charged a low % fee. So isn't that great? I'm going to lose my money by giving it to an idiot, but I'm going to charge a lesser fee. No. When you make the investment, you think you're handing a check to Lionel Messi. So it doesn't surprise you that he or she is asking for Lionel Messi or Gareth Bale, whatever, wages. So that's why I think there's a surprising amount of consistency on the 20% management fee. And a lot of the people who are out there claiming to be hedge fund managers are oftentimes just appropriating terminology. On the shadow banking, I won't declare an interest, but I'll declare kind of the philosophical kind of distinction that I make in my writing and the things that I talk about. I believe all market participants should be regulated as market participants, regardless of your structure, regardless of your organization. If we're going to have a rule on shorting, we're going to have a rule on short selling. I think it should apply to everyone. If you're a bearded, ginger-headed man with a balloon fetish, and you've got lots and lots of money, and you go around investing it yourself, or you're a hedge fund, or you're a division of a global investment bank, if you're engaging in a certain activity, I think the best regulatory regimes for that sort of market practice cut across all participants. I have problems when we say, well, we're going to have a different rule for short selling if you're a hedge fund than if you're another. So I don't want you to see it as a punt, but if there are issues about shadow banking, if there are issues about the making of loans and deposit taking and things like that, we should have a comprehensive set of rules that go across all of the participants in the market that focus on that particular type of investment activity and allow the market, allow the war for talent, allow the industry, the city, and Wall Street to evolve. Don't prescribe or have rules in place that push forward particular forms of organization and preference one over the other. If an activity is bad, it's probably bad if anyone does it. If an activity is good, it's probably good if anyone does it. So that's why I tend to take the view that we should just have a set of market rules that applies to everyone rather than trying to apply different rules to hedge funds just because they're hedge funds and they're scary. Any other questions? Oh. Anyone else have any questions?
Are there any market specifics that you enter? I mean, or private equity might be channeled towards. I'm particularly interested more in private equity, but is there any concentration, or can we claim that there's, let's say, in the Silicon Valley there are more private equity, etc.?
Yeah, the statistics that I think are still good, and I don't know that the global financial crisis has really shifted those. 70% of hedge fund managers are based in the States, they say. 70% of the rest are based in the UK. So that leaves something less than 10% of hedge fund managers other places around the world. That's shifting. And that's by number of managers. That's not by dollars. By some arguments, the third largest country for hedge funds now, US, UK, used to be Switzerland, now is the People's Republic of China. People's Republic of China. It's changing, it's globalizing. Anywhere there are liquid markets, there are hedge funds. And rather than hedge funds being concentrated in New York, Connecticut, or Chicago, or Los Angeles, San Francisco, you're now seeing them spread around the world. The division on private equity funds is a little bit flatter. Just over half of private equity funds are from the US. I think the UK has 11 or 12%. That gets you to about 62%. The rest are scattered around the world. There are private equity funds in Egypt and Tunisia. There are private equity funds in Brazil. There are private equity funds everywhere. Private equity funds are one answer to the question, what do you do with a dying company? What do you do with a dying company? If you've got a company and that company is dying, it's being wheeled in to A&E on a Saturday night and it's just dying. And the doctor's there, triage. The doctor's looking at the patient and thinking it's going to die. What do we do with a dying company? Private equity is one answer. Private equity is one answer. And a lot of people around the world are realizing that we have sick companies here. We have sick companies in Uzbekistan. We have sick companies in Paraguay. We've got sick companies. What do? Private equity gives you a set of tools, one set of tools, for how to take those companies into private ownership, restructure them using other people's money to provide a bridge of private ownership, and then release those companies back into the wild. It's like wildlife rescue. Release them back into the wild with little splints on their little legs. They're so cute as they go up. It's one tool, and it's globalizing. I have a chapter in this really great book I wrote that's available at Waterstones. The last chapter is on, the second to last chapter, is on the globalization of these funds. There's nothing particularly American about them, and it's not particularly British about them. Even though you bump into a lot of the men and women who work in these firms when you go to the West End, St. James's or Mayfair, there are models that have been transported around the world now. So when we talk about the regulatory reaction that we should have to them. When we should talk about what should the EU do about hedge funds, when we talk about what the SEC should do about hedge funds, we talk about these, we have to realize that the model is out. It's not that simple. It's not that complicated. If you want to be a hedge fund manager, what do you need? You need a Bloomberg, you need a cell phone, and you need other people's money. You can have a robe and fuzzy slippers, you can wear whatever you want to wear. That Bloomberg screen and that phone can be anywhere. But that's really all you need. There's no reason there shouldn't be hedge funds in China. There's no reason that there shouldn't be private equity funds in Brazil. The models have been proven successful to enough people, enough at the time, that people are now saying, well, let's apply that methodology in a lot of other countries. So I think those trends are going to continue in the next 20 years. You're going to see real powerhouses in private equity and hedge funds grow up indigenously in places like Brazil, in places like Russia, in places like China, in places like India. You're going to see a lot more of these models come up because the model itself is not linked to a particular regulatory system or a particular geographic. Is that helpful?
On that exact same point, you mentioned, I think obviously correctly, that they're driven very strongly by liquidity and a frequent
Hedge funds.
Yeah, frequent argument for, I guess, against regulation is the fact that it constrains liquidity in some respects. But how would you interpret the effects of, say, AIF&D, some of the aspects of Dodd-Frank, on the ability for hedge funds to come, I guess, the barriers to entry in the U.S. and the EU, and how do you think that's going to affect proliferation in other less regulated areas that would, like you mentioned?
I think that's a very good point. One of the reasons why hedge funds grew so quickly in number in the U.S., and the U.S. was so dominant in hedge funds for so many years, was alone among, as far as I was able to determine, alone among OECD developed countries. The United States was the only place where you could wake up in the morning and between putting your feet on the floor and walking to the mirror in the bathroom, you could decide to be a hedge fund manager, and you're a hedge fund manager. Don't I have to tell someone? No. Don't I have to file something somewhere? No. We had for decades and decades and decades and decades an incredibly liberal regime. We had something called the private advisory exemption. If you had fewer than 15 clients, fewer than 15 than 14. Why didn't they just say 14? I don't know. Fewer than 50. As long as you only had 14 clients, you didn't have to register with the SEC. You didn't have to do it. You didn't have to tell anyone. You're a hedge fund manager. You don't have to tell anyone. And the interesting thing is, those 14 clients, not people. They're not 14 people. They're 14 partnerships or Cayman companies. The SEC realized in about 2002 or 2003, there are people out there who realize this. They're talking, they leave at 4:30 every day, so this conversation had to occur like at 4 or 4:10, before they all left to go coach their children's softballs and soccer games. They had a conversation, I imagined it in my head, the SEC. Do you realize there are people out there managing billions and billions of dollars? We don't have an address for them. We don't know who to call. We don't know what building to go to. We have no idea even where these people live. And that frustrated. As soon as the SEC realized it, well, then they left at 4:30 and they coached their kids' soccer game, and they came back the next morning, and they were mad. They were mad. And they realized there's something that we have to do about this. And so the SEC did what regulators do. They had round tables, and they had town meetings, and they issued reports and white papers, and then they changed the rules. They changed the rules so you had to look through the entities and count all the investors in the funds. And that was going to pull everyone into registration. That was overturned in court, shocked everyone. A guy sued and said, yeah, you can't do that. You can't do that. And he won. Go figure. And that made the SEC really mad. But it was 2005, 2006, and there was nothing that could be done about it. And so they're pulling their hair out. What can they do? What can they do to pull these managers into registration? And fortunately, what happened? Global financial crisis. To quote the immortal words of Rahm Emanuel. Anyone here know who Rahm Emanuel is? He's currently the mayor of Chicago. He was formerly the chief of staff to President Obama. Never let a disaster go to waste. Never let a disaster go to waste. There was this great disaster, the global financial crisis. We think there were hedge funds fingerprints in all this. So let's just drop into the middle, almost exactly the middle. Chapter 4, Title 4 of the Dodd-Frank Act. Mandatory registration for all advisors. So it passed. No one debated it. It passed. It got in there on the statutory level, not on the rulemaking level, so no one could take them to court because it's law. And now we pulled in all of these managers. So we've seen a sea change in the U.S. In Europe and the UK, AIFMD, it's annoying. It's Fortress Europe. It's rules and regulations, one size fits all. Why does a private equity firm need a depository? What does that mean? But it's incremental changes. It's incremental changes that are annoying and not largely, but oftentimes inexplicable what the real world benefit will actually be. But we get that coming out of Brussels pretty regularly, so we shouldn't really waste too much time on that. But we've seen this big sea change here. We've seen the potential creation of Fortress Europe. It's definitely much, much harder now to form a fund manager, to form a brand new hedge fund manager, a brand new private equity fund manager. That's raising the barriers to entry. Will it have a net impact on the industry? The overwhelming majority of assets. Someone once told me, and they said it with a straight face, so I had to believe them, 80% of all the money managed by American hedge fund managers are managed by the top 100. 80% of all the money managed by American hedge fund managers managed by the top 100. The other, let's take the current number, call it 6,000. The other 5,900 have to divvy up the bottom 20% of the assets. I think there's a philosophical question about how easy or hard it is to start funds, because it's another way of proving talent. It's another way of being able to, generate a new potential star to rise. So I do think we have to be conscious of how easy or hard it is to get into the industry. But of all the things that you spend money on, the first year of being a hedge fund manager, one of the least invoices you have to pay are your lawyers, are your filing fees with the SEC, or the cost of a compliance officer. Look at all of the law students graduating every year. Look at all the former law firm associates who are now looking for alternate career paths. It's not expensive to hire a compliance officer. It's not expensive to have a compliance manual. It's not expensive to register with the SEC. When you look at the millions and millions and millions of dollars of brokerage fees you're going to pay to Goldman Sachs, and you look at the cost of your IT, those are massive costs. So I think it won't change liquidity. I don't think it will change the overall structure of the market. But the regulatory changes have increased the barriers to entry, and it's changed the way we practice law. My practice of law used to be about 90% just contracts, negotiations, GPs versus LPs, managers versus investors negotiation, and a little bit of regulation, 10%, less than 10% regulation. Now it's 50-50. Now it's 50-50. In the practice of law, regulation is much more important and much more prevalent. Will it help prevent the next global financial crisis? Well, will it prevent the next Bernie Madoff? It's interesting when you think about this, particularly in the U.S. context. The only reason the SEC found out about Bernie Madoff was because he walked into the FBI's office and said, "Fair enough, it's me, I did it. Here's what I did, here's how I did it, put the cuffs on me." The SEC had no clue. The SEC sent people out twice to do inspections. Didn't even know there were crimes being committed around them. Had no idea. If you look at the global financial crisis, and you look at the SEC's conduct before, during, and immediately after the global financial crisis, isn't it a little bit surprising that when Dodd-Frank came out, the great solution of Dodd-Frank was not a root and branch reconstruction of financial regulation. Let's tear up all the old statutes, let's disband all the old regulators, let's just do something completely different, completely new. That wasn't the response. We're actually going to go to the SEC, who didn't exactly cover itself in glory in the years leading up to and immediately after the financial crisis, and we're going to have them do more. We're going to give them more responsibilities, more rules to police, more things to potentially trip up over, having performed it either not fit for purpose or just short of adequate, whatever your verdict is. in those years, the SEC now gives them more and more and more responsibility. It seems to me to be an odd solution, but the SEC is there. The SEC is in the absolute middle of the approach that's now being taken in the U.S., much more closely to the European approach. It's a cost of doing business. If you really, really want to be the Lionel Messi of investing, it's just something that you've got to do now. But I don't see it as actually shifting the markets. I know a lot of people, when if this passes, it will be the end of the world as we know it. That's not true. That's not true. Largely speaking, the bigger funds that control most of the assets will continue along their way. But it's a question of how that talent replenishes itself. Because every career has an end. Every athlete retires, or should retire. Oftentimes they retire too late. But we need new people coming in. We need new people coming in. So it's something that I think is worth monitoring in the months and years to come is, are we refreshing talent? I know I've filled up our allotted time. I'm more than glad to answer any other questions, either one-on-one or otherwise. I know some people might have other places to go. I did when I was your age. So thank you for giving me the time. And the most important thing I could pass along to you is the location of the water stones. It's down there. And turn that. Thank you so much.